The overview of Scrum covers how the Scrum framework operates at a high level. That is, we'll be learning the official Scrum framework. Many teams and organizations have chosen to tailor their use of the Scrum framework for themselves. However, in this course, we'll need to focus on the core framework for two reasons. It's the only way to pass the difficult exam, and if you don't understand the official rules, you won't be understanding what risks you're taking by breaking the rules. There's only one thing I found worse for a company than breaking the rules of Scrum, and that is not even knowing what rules they're breaking. It's all in the Scrum Guide. The Scrum Guide itself is developed by Ken Schwaber and Joe Sutherland. You don't need to know this for the Scrum test, but it's useful to recognize their names. The Scrum Guide can also be accessed on their site, scrumguides.org. This will have a downloadable copy of the Scrum Guide, as well as an HTML version. Now I'll be giving you a rundown on what Scrum means. Scrum is a process framework that has been used for complex products since the early 1990s. The definition of Scrum is an important element of both Scrum as a whole and in passing the exam. This definition, as seen here, will be useful to know as a Scrum developer, and individual elements of it are good for figuring out questions you might not know entirely. It is as follows. Scrum, a framework with which people can address complex adaptive problems while productively and creatively delivering products of the highest possible value. That's the textbook answer. You'll need to know it, but by looking at different elements and knowing what they mean, you can make more use out of memorizing this. For example, if you remember this definition, you should know that Scrum is about maximizing value, and that adaptability is a core element of Scrum, and even more importantly, that Scrum is a framework and not a technique. Scrum was developed for managing and developing products since the early 1990s for these following reasons on the slide, as well as being used for all types of products such as hardware, software, and so many things that will be here all day if I actually list them. The point is, as technology, market, and environmental complexities and their interactions have rapidly increased, Scrum's utility in dealing with this complexity is proven daily. Other ways Scrum is useful is in iterative and incremental knowledge transfer. This is talking about how a new employee might be assisted in learning the methods and skills they need to function in a company, as well as develop already used methods. The essence of Scrum is a small team of people. The individual team is highly flexible and adaptive, even in cases where you have multiple Scrum teams or even whole networks of them. They still should be able to stay flexible and adaptive while working in sophisticated development architectures and target release environments. When the words develop and development are used in Scrum, they refer to complex work, such as really any of these. The definition of Scrum also involves some other key aspects. That is, it's lightweight, simple to understand, and difficult to master. Building on the Scrum definition itself, because we know it's a framework and have committed that to memory, we can remember that Scrum is also not a process, technique, or definitive method, but instead it's a framework where you can use all sorts of processes and techniques inside of. Scrum is about making maximum use out of what methods your team prefers, and making sure that the results are transparent so you can pivot to more efficient methods if needed. This really means making sure you don't even have to stick with using the same development tools the whole way through, and sometimes changing your method as you go is useful. The elements which make up Scrum are as follows. There are the Scrum roles, which involve 3 parts that sometimes overlap. Events, which there are 5, 4 contained within a 5th, the sprint. Artifacts, which there are 3 defined by Scrum specifically. And lastly, the rules of Scrum, which serve to bind all of these together and govern the rules and relationships between them all. The rules of Scrum will be anything but glossed over through this course, as they're the key to passing the Scrum exam. The specific tactics for using the Scrum framework are not needed for passing the exam, and can vary between companies, so learning them can be sometimes even detrimental if you're not willing to be flexible. Before diving into the details of the Scrum framework, it's useful to see the big picture and understand the structure of the framework. You'll be learning the details in subsequent lessons. As you can see here, there's an artifact labeled Product Backlog. You can think of this as a list of requirements that is prioritized by the product owner. The product backlog is a living artifact and never completed as long as the product exists. As you heard earlier, Scrum uses time boxes. The sprint is a time-boxed event that all other events as well as development team work is inside of it. The sprint planning meeting takes place on the first day of a sprint and is used for the Scrum team to plan the work for the sprint. The artifact produced and managed by the development team to keep the sprint plan and their progress is called the sprint backlog. This artifact also includes what features will be added to the product this sprint. Not only does the team plan at the start of each sprint, but they also perform inspection, adaptation, and planning every day in a 15-minute event called a daily Scrum. Some people call these daily stand-up meetings, but it's not a requirement in Scrum that they stand up. In fact, a daily Scrum could be a trip to the coffee shop together, as long as the team agrees and still talks about what a daily Scrum covers. The second last event in a sprint is called the sprint review, where the development team demonstrates what they've produced and completed in the sprint. The product owner may also invite stakeholders to this meeting. This is another inspect and adapt event. It's important that the product is truthfully demonstrated because of this, as transparency is still important. I'm sure everyone agrees on the importance of continual improvement and adapting, so that's why the development team participates in a sprint retrospective on the last event of a sprint. That's where they improve themselves, the processes they use, as well as think of how they can make the product even better. So what happens next? Well, you go straight from one sprint to the next, and the cycle repeats itself. We'll be learning a lot more about all of these steps in much more detail.